So we wanted to bring you two, I think, really important stories this morning of two incredibly courageous women activists who have now been imprisoned by different authoritarian regimes for the crime of daring to go against those governments. The first one we wanted to bring you was a Chinese journalist. You may have seen her work. Her name is Zhang Zhan, 37-year-old citizen journalist, first known person to face trial for chronicling China's outbreak. She's now been sentenced to 4 years in prison for daring to challenge the Chinese government's official narrative of what was going on with coronavirus. And in the early days of the pandemic, Rachel, she was really one of the only sources of accurate information coming out of Wuhan. This is from the New York Times. She traveled, she's a former lawyer, she traveled to Wuhan from her home in Shanghai in February at the height of China's outbreak to see the toll from the virus in the city where it first emerged. For several months, she was sharing videos that showed crowded hospitals, residents worrying about their incomes. She included criticism there and critique of the Chinese government narrative of what was happening on the ground. For a while, she and several other journalists had actually disappeared. She ends up facing trial and now imprisoned for 4 years just for exposing the truth of what was going on the ground there.
Yeah, this is what we always forget to talk about conveniently. A lot of times in our mainstream narratives about China, they are an authoritarian country. And nowhere, I think, has been this so demonstrated in how they've handled the coronavirus outbreak. Recall, the doctor that tried to raise the alarm about this was, forced to sign a retraction and then later died in a hospital. That should have been Times Person of the Year, full stop. And so this is what we see across the board. And yet this is still the country that we economically do the most business with, right? This is who our major corporations are in bed with. This is who Disney defends. This is who Google wants to work with. And these are the realities that we have to confront. If we're going to have a globalized system, our corporations are in bed with some pretty bad people.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And I think, look, this is an area where there tends to be these selective blind spots in either the left media ecosystem or the right media ecosystem. You can hold the view that we shouldn't be starting like some big war with China and also be clear-eyed about the incredibly horrific human rights abuses that are going on there with the imprisonment now of this journalist just being one example. And then on the other hand, if you're in a right media ecosystem, you may have missed this also incredibly important story about a women's rights activist in Saudi Arabia. I'm going to butcher her name, but I'm going to try anyway. Loujain al-Hathloul. She's a Saudi women's rights activist sentenced to nearly 6 years in prison. And I don't know if you remember, there was a whole movement of women challenging the ban on women being able to drive. And she was one of those who spearheaded that initiative. And the irony here, Rachel, is that MBS has actually now sort of for show lifted that ban, and yet they're still imprisoning one of the women activists who was instrumental in putting pressure on the regime to make this change ultimately. And the message that they seem to be wanting to send here is, look, change comes from the top. When we say it comes, we're not going to have any of this like grassroots movements and human rights activists bubbling up from the ground up.
Yeah, not just imprisoning, but according to that story, she's also being tortured and harassed.
That's right.
Again, simply for the crime of driving into Saudi Arabia. But again, I think this sort of is an analog to the China situation where, you're not allowed to criticize Saudi Arabia. We don't actually hold them accountable for the terrible way that they treat, members of their country. We continue to sell them arms deals, right? Trump, I think, signed a $110 billion deal with them. Obama wasn't far behind. And, we're not, the Senate and the House won't even debate the role that U.S. government funding has played in funding the Saudi involvement in Yemen that has resulted in thousands of civilian casualties. This is a direct link between U.S. Military funding and Saudi Arabia resulting in civilian deaths. We can't even debate it on the Senate floor. Or the House floor. Thomas Massey in the House tried to bring this up, was shut down by Pelosi, a combination of Republican and Democrat leadership, both telling him to be quiet. And again, so this is just an area where, to your point, whether you're on the right or the left, you're getting certain stories and not others because it's appropriate to criticize some relationships and not others. And I think these are two perfect examples of that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And part of why you've had that bipartisan consensus around protecting Saudi Arabia and never criticizing any of their vast number of human rights abuses is because they fund so many of the think tanks and so many of the organizations in this town. And so it's not just, the reliance that we've had on them for oil and the sort of strategic relationship that we've had with them in the region that's caused us to turn a blind eye to anything bad that they ultimately do. But it's also the fact that, their money runs through this town through almost every organization you can think of.
Yeah, and I think that's really the critical point because, again, I don't ascribe to this Samantha Power doctrine of we need to engage everywhere across the world. We need to go to war over humanitarian issues because I don't actually think that solves the problem. The best way to get at these issues is to, one, give them sunlight, but two, call out the sort of financial ties to these countries, because that is what's most important here and most powerful here is how our sort of corporate elites, our media elites, and our government elites are protecting these horrific actors. And we have to be a country that can hold two things in our mind at the same time. We should be able to talk about where it's appropriate to work with these countries and talk about where it's not. But right now it's a blackout on both.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And you look like hypocrites when you pick and choose which human rights abuses and which, expressions of democracy which are quashed that you decide to care about. So wanted to highlight both of those stories because I think both of them are incredibly significant and both of these women incredibly courageous and did a great service not only to their own people, but really to the world itself. Rachel, thank you so much. Stick with us. We're going to have more Rising for you after this.